Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for another discography ranking. And today we are going to be looking at the albums by blues rock, garage rock, rock and roll icon of the 2000s, Jack White. So in this video, we are going to be including all of the core projects that Jack White has contributed to as a primary songwriter or as a musician. That is including 6 solo albums, 6 albums with the White Stripes, 3 albums with the Raconteurs, and 3 albums with the Dead Weather. The White Stripes, of course, were White's first major project, a collaborative effort with his then wife, Meg, that played a formative influence in the Detroit garage rock scene of the early 2000s, and chances are if you have heard any song involving Jack White, if you're not familiar with his work, it is probably the White Stripes' Seven Nation Army, pretty major song in the world of 2000s rock. The success of albums like White Blood Cells and Elephant made White a sought-after collaborator, and he has worked with a number of high-profile musicians since then, of course, one of his most famous being producing the album Van Leer Rose for Loretta Lynn in 2004. The Raconteurs formed in 2005 as a collab between White and the power pop songwriter Brendan Benson, and the Dead Weather came about as a spin-off of that group when White began working with Alison Mosshart of The Kills, a group that had opened for the Raconteurs on one of their tours. And of course, in addition to these other projects, White has also engaged with his own creative indulgences through a number of solo projects that push his music away, in some ways anyways, from the garage rock sounds of his other works and towards more eclectic sound palettes that may incorporate things like country or even electronica. The only one of these projects that has come to a proper close is the White Stripes. The band officially disbanded in 2011 for reasons that are a bit vague, but possibly related to Meg White wanting to step back from touring life. The Dead Weather have mostly been on hiatus for the better part of a decade, but the Raconteurs continue to record new material and reportedly even have a new album in the works from the little bit that I've gathered. And White, for his own part, put out his most recent solo album, No Name, just this past year. So we have 18 albums in total to talk about here, and while the collaborators on these projects, like Meg White, like Benson, like Mosshart, etc., will be spotlighted when we talk about these records, the core of this video is going to be about Jack White as a sort of unique musical visionary. He is ultimately the center of all of these projects, or one of the core centers anyways. His own input, his own influence is paramount and evident everywhere. So rather than trying to partition these into different videos where we talk about the White Stripes discography in one video, Raconteurs in another, Jack White solo in another, etc., I think it makes more sense to talk about all these projects as one collective whole. All of these as different sort of manifestations of Jack White as an artist. So, without further ado, let's jump on in. At my number 18, my least favorite Jack White related project, I have the most recent record by the Dead Weather, 2015's Dodge and Burn. The Dead Weather are, I would say, fairly solidly my least favorite Jack White endeavor, just in general. And it's not because they're bad. I like all of these albums to different degrees, I suppose. But the Dead Weather to me feels, maybe I wouldn't say the most generic of the bunch, but the one where White's influence is not as evident all the time, or at least I think the more eccentric sides of White's personality don't appear as much. And for me anyways, I think the eccentricity of Jack White, as we will find out in this ranking, is a huge part of the appeal. So it's fairly neutered on the Dead Weather records for the most part. And with Dodge and Burn specifically, I think this is the most straight ahead record in their whole catalog. From a songwriting standpoint, I don't think these songs really pass up to muster compared to the other tracks. I think it is a little bit on the generic side. And I think, look, one thing that you will hear kind of throughout my discussions here is that as a songwriter, I'm not entirely sure yet how high of esteem I hold Jack White in, just in general. Certainly as a lyricist, I don't necessarily hold him in very high esteem, but usually I think it is what White does to the songs, and it's how he packages the songs with these interesting guitar textures and things like that that make them captivating. And this is one where I don't think the very basic song structures and the very rudimentary lyrical content is lifted up by much of anything in particular. Some good songs on here. I Feel Love is probably the best thing on the record, but nothing that I'm going to be going out of my way to come back to at any point in the foreseeable future, for sure. It's a decent record. I would not be offended if anyone put it on, for sure, but I would absolutely say that Dodge and Burn by the Dead Weather is the least essential Jack White related project, and it comes in at my number 18. At number 17, I have the most recent record by the Raconteurs, 2019's Help Us Stranger. I'm not like that head over the heels about the Raconteurs as a project across the board either, but I do prefer them to the Dead Weather in the sense that I think their high points are significantly more interesting to me personally. And this record, I think from a songwriting standpoint, is not that much stronger than Dodge and Burn is, but what puts this one over the edge to the point where I can solidly say that I like it is I think the guitar stuff on here is really awesome. I mean, it's so heavy at points. I don't know if it's down-tuned or just the tones and the pedal choices that they're utilizing, but it seems so heavy that it almost leans into like late 60s proto-metal sounds at points, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that. It's that, you know, that level of like early Zeppelin, early Sabbath, like blues rock heaviness. The chromatic rips in tracks like What's Yours Is Mine is, I think, very, very metal-like in how they're deploying. Again, I don't think the songs here register as much as the composers would have liked, at least lyrically, but you still get some strong melodic points here. Shine the Light on Me I like quite a bit. And the closing track, Thoughts and Prayers, I really like because I think it brings the record back to their previous album sonically in an interesting way. And you will see that I like the second Raconteurs record a good bit. So being able to throw it back to that more kind of country-infused texture is always going to be a plus. I think there's some good songs on here, but again, it's not fully compelling as an album, and again, not as individualistic as some of these other records on this list are. So it's good. I wouldn't dissuade anyone from listening to it, but not a clear highlight for me in this discography. The Raconteurs, Help Us Stranger, my number 17. At number 16, and there are going to be a couple of opinions on this list that I think are going to be controversial to people, and this might be one of them, but I have the first Jack White solo album, 2012's Blunderbuss. I know a lot of people really like this record. There are plenty of people who highlight this as one of the best things that Jack White has ever done, and perhaps the best thing that he's ever done as a solo artist, certainly. And I don't quite meet them where they're at this point. I think this is a good record, quite a good record, actually. But I think, to me, this is, in some ways, the least adventurous solo record that Jack White has done. And, again, I like it when White gets eccentric and when he pushes himself. And I don't feel like this record is doing that. To me, this feels like taking the core White Stripes sound, like where the Stripes had kind of gotten to by Icky Thump by their last record, and smoothing it out a little bit. You don't have the same sort of unhinged aggression that you do in those later Stripes records. And if that description sounds appealing to you, if you're not fully bought into the Stripes as a vehicle for Jack White as a songwriter, then this might be where the appeal comes in for you. This might be where you really enjoy Blunderbuss, because it is a little bit more stable, I guess, in some ways. But for me, I like the aggressiveness of the Stripes, so smoothing it out is not necessarily my idea of improving the quality of the music, I suppose. That said, still a lot that I like here. I like the, again, emphasis on melodicism, some really great melodies on here. There are some occasional eccentric instrumental choices on here. like the vocal approach. Some of the vocals on the track "I'm Shaking" is one that stands out to me here. There are several great songs. I think 16 Saltines is really good. Title track is quite good. On and On and On, I think, is really interesting. It's just, and maybe this is just because this record is the definition of a slow burn, something that just kind of grows on you more and more over time. But I didn't feel like I could really latch onto it in a way that a lot of these other records allowed me to. So in that sense, this is probably the artsiest thing and the cleanest thing that Jack White has done to this point as a solo artist or as a collaborator. And there's something to that. There's certainly value in that. But at least right now, I think there's a lot of other Jack White projects that I would rather listen to before putting this on. But I could see this growing on me easily for sure as well. So for right now, Blunderbuss comes in at number 16, but I do think there is room to grow. At number 15, I have the debut record by The Dead Weather, 2009's Whorehound. So this record, what I like about it is that there's a certain sludginess to this project that is very distinct compared to Jack White's other stuff, and I do like that. I think one of the pieces that I think is interesting about The Dead Weather is that this is the project where Jack White is kind of stepping away from the guitars for the most part. He is focusing on being the drummer of the band, which is really cool. And he's a good drummer. He's technically like a perfectly fine drummer and works really well for this material. The problem is, he still has a vocal presence on here, but I do think it is missed at some points. I think, and it's not a slagging off of Alison Mosshart as a vocalist. I think she is fine for the material. I don't dislike her vocals. I wouldn't say they stand out as highlights, but I think they fit the material well enough for what they're trying to do. But I do think that I like it more when The Dead Weather are pitting Mosshart and White, kind of, bouncing them off of each other in a way that I think the best Raconteurs material does with White and with Brendan Benson. But here I think this is a little bit more of a Mosshart showcase. So in that sense, you don't get quite as much of a balance. Again, some cool moments. I think it starts off really well with 60 Feet Tall and Hang You from the Heavens. I'm also really partial to the Bob Dylan cover on here, New Pony. I think they really sell that one really well. But I do think this was a record that kind of peters off a little bit for me from a quality standpoint towards the end of the record. So it's a solid project. I think it's, again, in some ways more interesting than the other projects that I have called out so far. But again, in a discography where I think, the more Jack White and the weirder Jack White gets, the better. Again, this is not really a project that indulges either of those things. So The Dead Weather, Whorehound, very good record, but only coming in at my number 15. At number 14, I have the self-titled debut record by the White Stripes from 1999. Man, this record kind of smashes onto the scene for sure. It's not a fully established band at this point. I still think, this is, as you can tell, my least favorite White Stripes record, and I think they only continue to get better for the most part. But already, I think a lot of the strengths of the band are very apparent. There's already a really great sense of feel here. These aren't like, yes, this is the most straightforward blues rock thing that the Stripes ever did. And what I like about it is that it's not just that these are blues pastiches. They actually feel like very 90s core song structures. Like the compositional structure of these songs a lot of times feels very akin to a lot of other 90s rock, but they're molded into blues patterns and these blues textures, and with White's guitar just kind of wailing over everything, which I think is really cool. I think Wasting My Time is one of the absolute best songs on the record. I think a big highlight in that sense. Now, you do have, again, the traditional blues influence here, and that is, again, much more apparent on this record than on any other Stripes record. The track Cannon on here has a very, very clear Blind Willie Johnson interpolation in it, for instance, that I think is really cool. I also really like the Bob Dylan cover on here. So back-to-back Dylan references, One More Cup of Coffee. And, one thing that strikes me as a parent when listening to really the whole discography, the whole kind of Jack White canon, is how much it feels like White's voice vocally is indebted to Robert Plant's approach to singing, from a tonal standpoint and from a diction standpoint. And so it's interesting to hear White covering this song, which Plant himself would cover just a few years later on his own album. So yeah, really strong, really great energy from the start. And I'll get on my Meg White pedestal a little bit here, in the sense that I think Meg White is kind of the perfect foil for the Stripes as a drummer. I think it's, here's the thing with Meg White. She is by no means an objectively great drummer, but I think the thing that you have to keep in mind throughout everything is that Jack White is doing a lot as a guitarist. He is doing an exorbitant amount of different things, trying to keep the material engaging, and he keeps the mix very busy in that sense. Having a drummer like Meg White, who is not technical enough to do a lot of very fast-paced things on the drums, but is powerful enough to at least keep a really strong beat, is perfect. If we had someone who is having a lot of power, but also doing a lot of frenetic stuff on the drums, that creates a very busy mix that might be more overwhelming. But Meg White and her approach within her limitations keeps things, it's a perfect balance, I think. It's a perfect mixture between the two things. And I think that counterbalance is apparent right from the get-go and continues all the way through the very end. So just to get on that pedestal right now, I think Meg White, not a great drummer objectively, but from a standpoint of how she fits within the music, I think it's a perfect fit. I don't think it could have worked any better. So with that said, the self-titled debut is my least favorite White Stripes record, but I think it's a really strong, really promising start to their career, and it's so fascinating to see how they will continue to evolve from here. White Stripes debut, my number 14. At number 13, I have the Dead Weather with 2010's Sea of Cowards. As I said, this is, the Dead Weather are not my favorite Jack White project, so this is the last time they'll be mentioned in the list. I do like this one a little bit more than Whorehound. I think that the sound here is actually quite a bit different. There's a lot more kind of glitchier and electronic moments and things like that happening here, which I think is really interesting. And I think that Moss Hart as a vocalist actually sounds a bit more natural in this setting, so I think this aesthetic fits her and puts her in a better position to succeed than maybe the debut record did. I also hear a lot more Jack White on here, which is, again, a good thing in my eyes. I find his drums are a lot more prominent here. I'm starting to hear his vocals come through a little bit more. And the result is a really, really solid rock record, quite a strong record. I think the opening track, Blue Blood Blues, is really fantastic and kick-ass. I think that Die by the Drop is really great. Gasoline, Jawbreaker, really just, again, a strong rock album with some strong drumming from White. And I think the closest that this Dead Weather project has come to releasing a truly great record. Again, I'm not remarkably enthusiastic about this compared to the other stuff on this list, but I do think that if you are looking for one record to explore from the Dead Weather, if you're looking to, again, try to get into that side of White as a performer and as a musician, I think Sea of Cowards is the one I would recommend starting with. I think it's the most interesting one to me. Perhaps the one that has the most direct linkages to what White would do as a solo artist later on as well. So with those two things in mind, I think Sea of Cowards is the Dead Weather release that I would recommend. On the overall list, it comes in at my number 13. At number 12, I have the second Jack White solo record, 2014's Lazaretto. So this album builds off of the aspects of Blunderbuss that I like and kind of takes them into slightly different directions. In the sense that I think there's a sonic linkage between the two records, but I don't think Lazaretto is just a carbon copy or just a clear continuation. I think this record, you are starting to hear White experiment with country textures a little bit more evidently. And I really like when Jack White does that. I think that, when he kind of incorporates those elements into his sound, it feels novel and it feels fresh, but it also feels like it's coming from someone who knows what they're doing as well. Like, just because the White Stripes were not a country band, and just because Jack White doesn't engage with this style a lot, it's clearly evident, I think, that he understands the genre and understands how to write for it and that sort of thing. I think Three Women is a really solid opener. Title track, I think, is really great. I'm really partial to Highball Stepper. I think as far as the Jack White instrumental canon goes, I think that's one of his absolutely coolest instrumentals that he's ever done. My favorite song on here is probably that Black Bat Licorice, though. I think that track has, it's White going a little bit bizarre on the bit, which I love. The riff on here is just kind of delightfully haunted, and kind of the cadence of everything, the cadence of like the vocals and the pacing of the song. It's a lot of fun. It's really cool. And I think, again, kind of puts the record in a solid space to kind of end it off on a really solid note, with the two tracks afterwards. I still don't think it's a clear highlight of like the Jack White solo canon, but to me, I think in many ways this record is more interesting from a songwriting standpoint, more interesting texturally than Blunderbuss is. And while this by no means will showcase what he is going to do eventually later on in his solo career, quite the opposite, I still think this is a record that is arguably a little bit underrated in the grand scheme of things, as far as how people tend to evaluate it, and I think is worth revisiting. Again, I like it when Jack White goes a little bit more country on the bit, and you definitely get plenty of those moments here. Lazaretto by Jack White comes in at my number 12. At number 11, we're going back to the Jack White solo canon again with 2022's Entering Heaven Alive. So this record is coming on in the wake of the previous two solo projects, Boarding House Reach and Fear of the Dawn, which are two of the most experimental things, maybe the two most experimental things that Jack White has ever done. And so with this record, I think a lot of people perceive this as White trying to make a record for the normies, basically trying to do something that is a little bit more accessible, like consciously a reactionary record in that sense. And maybe it is. Maybe that is the perspective that he is approaching this with. But boy, I don't think this feels like a compromise. This still feels very intentional to me, as far as he is purposely, really intentionally making strong records in this more kind of acoustic milieu. I actually hear parallels between this record and Lazaretto sonically in some ways. So I like the acoustic songwriting. I think in many ways, this record actually is one of the better showcases of Jack White just as a pure songwriter, because of how stripped back it is for the most part. Now, that's still not to say that you don't get some eccentric experimentation and things like that. There are several tracks on here that dip into this like mixture of kind of jazzier type stuff with like trip hop vibes, throwing it back to the 90s, tracks like I've Got You Surrounded and A Madman from Manhattan, both of which I think are clear highlights on the record. So we're still, not in completely acoustic territory. We're not in completely just like roots rock territory. That's for, Jack to do with No Name a couple years later. But it's still, it feels more, again, it feels like we're getting to the essence of White as a songwriter in a much more palatable format to the average person than the two records before it. I also like Please God Don't Tell Anyone quite a bit. Really nice swung feel to that one. It's a really strong record. It's a fundamentally strong record. And while I don't come at this from the standpoint of thinking this is an improvement on Boarding House Reach or Fear of the Dawn, obviously, given where I have this ranked compared to the other two. I also don't believe that this is just a compromise and that this is significantly weaker. I actually think this is quite an underappreciated record in the grand scheme of things. And so much like what I was saying with Lazaretto, I think this is worth giving another shot and trying to have it grow on you a little bit. I think there's actually quite a few gems on this record that are worth reappraisal. Entering Heaven Alive, Jack White, 2022, my number 11. At number 10, I have the debut record by the Raconteurs, 2006's Broken Boy Soldiers. So White's project with Brendan Benson, who I don't know Brendan Benson's solo material. I haven't heard any of his solo albums, but I do know that he is a singer-songwriter with a rock, but especially like kind of a power pop background. And so this record is really meant to be what seems like a 50-50 collaboration between White and Benson, where you get pretty equal focus on both of their songwriting styles and trying to merge them together here. And for the most part, I think it works pretty doggone well. You have White taking in some of the experimentation that he was doing with the Stripes at that point, with the Get Behind Me Satan and that sort of thing, mixing that with stronger pop songwriting. There's a very, very strong kind of melodic vibe to this record that is clearly, I think, somewhat of Benson's doing, although, again, I don't want to diminish White as a melody writer either. Steady As She Goes is the central thing here. It's the first song they wrote together. It's the opening track, and it's maybe the best song the Raconteurs ever did. I think it's a terrific way to open the record. Great, great hook to it. Great vocals, great guitar playing on it. Just could not ask for a better way to start off this project. And it doesn't get to that same level afterwards, with possibly one exception, and that being the title track, which in some ways I may actually prefer to Steady As She Goes, just because it has kind of a vaguely late 60s tinge to it. There's some kind of echo going on in the guitar parts combined with this very gritty vocal. And I really, really like that. I like it when this record, again, shows a bit of that edge to it. I'm also really partial to the closing track, Blue Veins. It's kind of a lean into the more experimental side of things. Again, a great riff on here. And there's one point where it kind of, you hear like backwards guitars and backwards vocals deploying, which again, throws it into kind of psychedelic realms and things like that. I guess maybe what the conclusion is from all this is it's a strong record front to back, I think. And I don't want to diminish any of the middle sections of the stuff that feels more Benson heavy. But the moments that feel like White has a little bit more influence on the direction, which to my ears would seem to be the more psychedelic ones, and the ones where the guitar is a little bit more aggressive and where they're fucking around a little bit more with the production, those are the highlights to me. Those are the best moments. And I think hearing them kind of take those sounds and evolve them onto the next record, which I think they do even better, I think it's really interesting. It's a record that shows a lot of potential and does work very well as a standalone release. But I think in many ways, Broken Boy Soldiers serves as a launching pad for what they will do on their follow-up record in many ways. So Broken Boy Soldiers by the Raconteurs, really, really good record. Definitely worth checking out. Again, if you want to hear White in a bit more of a melodic context, a more melody-forward context anyways. And it comes in at my number 10. At number 9, I have the White Stripes with 2000's Distill. Second record by the Stripes, and I think it's really, in many ways, a perfect evolution of what they were trying to do on the debut record. You're starting to hear the energy really ramp up more and more here. I would argue that these songs, compared to the debut, which is very straightforward kind of blues rock in many ways, I think this one has a bit of a rawer garage rock sound that I think works really well. Again, it's not quite as fully formed from a song-to-song standpoint as White Blood Cells and the records after that will be, but again, we're seeing a band that is very close, I think, to making that kind of final leap. A band with a lot of potential that's already made significant improvements in many different ways. And that's sort of embodied by this opening run of tracks, which is one of the best opening runs of tracks of any of these records. Really love the opener. You're Pretty Good Looking for a Girl. I think the way that it starts with this kind of, monaural mix, this mono mix, right? Where everything's in the center and everything seems condensed. It's a perfect kind of retro throwback in a way that also I think serves as a really nice way of building tension too. Because while the song itself is sharp, it works very well as a standalone piece. I think that also makes the follow-up track Hello Operator hit a little bit harder, because you were going from this very condensed mix where all the energy is in the center to now all of a sudden everything's in stereo and White's guitar is kind of jumping around all over the place. And it's a great, unique and subtle way to kind of build that tension and let it explode so that the record just starts with this freight train of momentum. And that continues through Hello Operator, which is terrific. Little Bird is great. Apple Blossom, very possibly the best song on the record. Just such a strong start to things. And again, the energy is really good. I think White as a vocalist continues to be really eccentric and interesting. And yeah, it's a strong record. The songwriting has taken a major leap from the debut record, even if they will continue to take further leaps on their future stuff as well. It's great. It's a great record. And again, at this point, we're now at the point of time where there are just 8 records that I think are maybe a little bit more complete, a little bit more fleshed out, and a little bit more preferable for my ears than this one. But Distill, really great energy to it. Really promising record. And yeah, great stuff. It comes in at my number 9. At number 8, I have 2022's Fear of the Dawn. So it's interesting because Jack White as a solo artist has 2 very apparent kind of experimental records in his solo catalog, Boarding House Reach and this. And people believe that there is this massive gulf in general between these 2 records. Like, people are very receptive to the experimentation of Fear of the Dawn, not very receptive to the experimentation on Boarding House Reach, at least from what I've seen. Now, obviously, for my rankings here, you'll see that I have a little bit of the opposite opinion. I don't think there's a massive gulf at all. But what I will acknowledge is Boarding House Reach feels zany and feels kind of unhinged. It feels like we're kind of just throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. Now, we have Fear of the Dawn 4 years later, which is still very experimental, is still trying a lot of different things, but feels a lot more intentional about it, I think. It's not just White kind of playing around with textures that are potentially foreign to him, trying to figure things out kind of on the fly. This feels like White has a little bit more control as a songwriter, as a producer. Like, he's understanding, like he feels like he has a grasp of the tools that he's using now. And there's a lot of value in that. I think that's really cool. I think the record starts off really well with the title track and Taking Me Back. You have tracks like Heidi Ho on here, again, leaning into the experimental side of things with these kind of Eastern instrumental patterns that are like fit into these blues-based riffs. And that in and of itself doesn't necessarily sound revelatory, because you have bands like Zeppelin that were doing that with Kashmir and things like that. But then you surround that with a Q-tip feature, which fits, I think, a lot better than it has any right to on that track. I think it works very well. I think it's really cool. Into the Twilight is one of the tracks that I think carries a little bit more of that Boarding House Reach spirit, in the sense it's kind of fucking around with guitar tones that are kind of wubbing like dubstep synths somehow, in this very kind of amorphous, vibrating sort of way. It's really interesting. So don't get me wrong. Like, Fear of the Dawn is throwing a lot of things around, even if, again, it feels a little bit more concentrated and a little bit more composed, I suppose, than Boarding House Reach was. It's still messing around a lot. But you also have tracks like Morning, Noon, and Night, some of the stuff at the end, where you're getting into much more kind of straightforward rock territory than Boarding House Reach was. So you still have a nice mixture, and I think in that sense that helps ground this record a little bit more to the general public, and maybe is why this record was a little bit better received than Boarding House Reach was. Now, Again, I don't prefer To Boarding House Reach because there's something about the zaniness of that record that really speaks to me. But Fear of the Dawn, I think, is a great album. And again, I like eccentric Jack White. Give me more of these types of records, please. Really interesting stuff, really engaging, really unique album. Very underrated still, I think, in a lot of ways. And a record that I think, even for me, could probably grow higher with repeated listens. Fear of the Dawn, Jack White, my number 8. At number 7, I have the final White Stripes record, 2007's Icky Thump. So, after the Stripes records have, slowly but surely been getting into not only more, stronger songwriting and that sort of thing, but more experimentation as well, culminating with Get Behind Me, Satan in that regard, Icky Thump sees everything kind of pulled back a little bit into a little bit more of a pocket. This feels a little bit more straightforward than the previous White Stripes stuff had been. And in that sense, I don't like it quite as much as Get Behind Me, Satan, but I do think this record still stands out to me as better than a couple of the other Stripes records that came before it. I know some people don't think this might have been the worst thing they ever did. I don't agree with that at all. One thing that stands out is the sonics of this. This is the only Stripes record, I believe, that was recorded in a professional studio. It was recorded in Nashville, and I think you really hear that increase in sound quality here. And I like it in this context. I know some of the Stripes appeal is that they are kind of lo-fi, makeshift, record with whatever you have available, or at least projecting that vibe. But I do like hearing them in a bit more of a professional setting as well. Title track is a superb opener, a really, really, really great song. But if I had to pick a personal favorite on this album, and possibly the most underrated Stripes record, or Stripes song for me in general, it is 300 Mile Per Hour Torrential Outpour Blues. I love that song. I love the really sharp kind of dynamic contrasts in here. Again, the louder sections mixed with the quiet sections, always something that I'm drawn to in songs and in songwriting. So this song really kind of projects that in spades. I love that. As I said, possibly the most underrated Stripes track. I also think, again, you hear the kind of Zeppelin influence still on this record, even though we're, almost a decade removed from the debut and that sort of thing. You still hear it on tracks like Prickly Thorn, but Sweetly Worn. The folk influences here, I think, are some of the clearest examples of hearing that kind of Zeppelin, that English folk, that English blues influence really rub off on the crowd here. Not everything is superb on the record still. I know the kind of middle track, St. Andrew, is not one of the stronger Stripes tracks. And something that can occasionally bother me at points, it was especially noticeable in this record, but I hear it in some of the other Stripes stuff as well, is how live the snare sounds. And it might be a nitpick, but like the track Rag and Bone, for instance, is one where I noticed that snare sound really coming through in a very, again, bright, lively, and almost like tinny sort of way. I'm not saying it sounds as bad as like, say, like a St. Anger type of snare drum sound, but it sounds like it's one of those things that's on the way to that, right? Like just get a fucking drum ring on the snare or something to deaden the sound a little bit. Cause yeah, it was sort of jarring to me, although I might be on an island with that. But Icky Thump is a really strong record. It is, I think, a good way to close the band's career. Not a record that was intentionally chosen to close the band's career by any means, but I think it works really well. I think it's a high point to cap off their career with, and I think it sets White up for the projects that he would do in the late aughts and early 2010s pretty well. I think you can hear, again, some of that continuity there with some what he's doing on things like Blunderbuss, for instance. So Icky Thump, final White Stripes record, great stuff, comes in at my number 7. At number 6, I have 2018's Boarding House Reach. So this record, I want to talk about controversial opinions. A lot of people have this at or near the bottom of the Jack White canon in general. This was a record where I remember when this thing came out, and I remember the reception that it got from people and how mixed it was. I know that you had people like Anthony Fantano who absolutely adored the record and thought it was the best thing that Jack White had done in a very long time, possibly ever. And then you had various other people, friends of mine, people who I followed, who were really negative on it. Oliver Kemp from the YouTube channel Deep Cuts, for instance. I remember him hating this record and just reaming it in a video that he did. And he's like one of the most positive music guys out there. I'd never heard him criticize a record like this. Very polarizing. And I remember checking this out when it came out and absolutely taking the side of this is terrible. This is trash. Throw it away. Then I revisited it a few years later when I first went through like the Jack White, White Stripe stuff, and I liked it a lot more. And now after hearing it again for basically the third time at this point, it's grown on me again. I think the reason why is sort of the flip side of what has, I think, polarized people. Yes, this is probably the weirdest Jack White record, but I also think that it is at the same time so distinctly Jack White. Even if it does stand completely apart from so many of his other records, it still wears his badge. It still has White's ideas tattooed all over that admittedly kind of horrifying album cover. I think you have these kind of blues song structures, these blues ideas and things like that are just being completely deconstructed in some tracks, some more than others, and transformed into completely different like monsters and things like that. This is a demented record in many ways. It's very strange. The track Corporation, which a lot of people point to as a highlight, and for good reason. I think it's a brilliant song. The riff on it is absolutely killer. And hearing, again, the strange kind of guitar tones that White's playing with and his vocals where he's like screeching on here, kind of that like raptor screech thing that like Roger Waters would do with Pink Floyd a lot. It's demented. It's amazing. I love it. One of my favorite Jack White solo tracks. Hypermisophoniac is almost claustrophobic with how much is going on in that track. It's so busy. There's so much going on in the production, but I can't get enough of that. The when you're robbing the bank, that like Talking Heads like hook that he's doing here. I think it's terrific. I like it almost in spite of myself. Ice Station Zebra I think is really cool. Over and Over and Over is probably the closest thing to like a trademark traditional Jack White song that you have on the record. But the backing vocals on that one still kind of cause it to stand out. And actually, in a weird way, the backing vocals that are like slightly gospel tinged, I guess, are actually not something that I'm very keen on. I actually don't really consider Over and Over and Over to be a personal highlight on the record for me, in part because of that. I like the weird stuff. I like the weird shit. There's still a limit to what I am willing to, I suppose, put up with. Get in the Mine Shaft is maybe the one where I kind of check out from a production standpoint. The kind of phased vocals that you have and that like fart bass that he's got going on. That might be the point where the production gets a little bit too much for me. And I do agree with the criticisms that ultimately it sounds like Jack White is playing around with textures and with ideas that he doesn't have a complete grasp on. It sounds like he is uncomfortable at points and he's fucking around with, whether that's instrumentation, whether that's programming and things like that, that things that are not natural to him. I can understand that being a critique and that it comes across so evidently on the record and that sort of thing. I can understand that. But again, I do think there is something charming and really cool about such an established musician taking such a massive risk. It's almost a very vulnerable thing to do. There's no almost about it. It is a very vulnerable thing to do, to put himself in that space. And so as a result, I think it's a record that I don't see how it's anything less than fascinating, at least. Even if it's not your thing at all. I think the fact that this record exists and the fact that, again, even with the experimental stuff that he's done on previous records, the fact that there's no real parallel to this in his discography, certainly beforehand, it's something else. It's a fascinating record. It's a record that inspires a lot of capital D discourse, and I'm all about it. I love it. Great record, I think. Really entertaining. I always get a lot out of it when I listen to it at this point. And while it doesn't quite make the top 5, absolutely, I think, an underrated record and worth revisiting. Boarding House Reach, my number 6. At number 5, I have the Raconteurs with 2008's Consolers of the Lonely. Really great album. Like, to me, anyways, so far above the other kind of Jack White side project stuff, not the solo stuff, but the other side projects, that it's not even funny. This is up there with the very best White Stripes stuff and up there with his best solo stuff. You are, at this point, I think the success of this record is that it is the Raconteurs record that leans the most into Jack White as an individual. And that's not a slight against Brendan Benson, but I do think you hear a lot less of the power pop influences that are all over the first Raconteurs record, and you are now hearing something that is a lot more steeped in kind of traditional rock textures, some that are kind of more bluesy, some that are more country in nature. And I think it just really stands out as like a band record. You know, if you separate the White Stripes, because the White Stripes, again, really is a 2-person outfit, so they're maybe not a band in the same type of sense. As far as like hearing White working with a band of musicians, there's only one record that I think is a little bit more engaging than this. I think this is stellar. I love hearing White in this kind of setting. Opening track is really, really strong. I think Salute Your Solution is really great. I like Old Enough a lot. That's one that I think engages with the country influences a little bit more. It just, all these songs are highlighting the band as really strong players. You get, I think, a lot more Jack White on here than you do on the debut record. At least I feel like I hear White a little bit more prominently in the vocals, although Benson is certainly there too. It sounds great. The recording quality is really, really strong. I think it succeeds in a lot of different ways. I think it ranks up there with some of the better kind of alt rock, country rock records of the aughts for sure. And yeah, there's not much more to be said. I think it's just an extremely consistent record. I don't necessarily know that I have clear highlights or a clear favorite song on here, but it's really consistent. It's really strong. It doesn't outstay its welcome. And if you have not heard any of the non-White Stripes or Jack White solo projects, I think Consolers of the Lonely is the one to prioritize for sure. Really great rock record, really great band record, and a very strong entry. It's my number 5. At number 4, I have the White Stripes with 2001's White Blood Cells. The record that I think solidly put them on the map from a national standpoint, to still had gotten into the point where they were receiving a lot of more kind of local hype, more quote-unquote underground hype. White Blood Cells is where they sort of, explode in popularity, and that will only become more profound when Elephant comes out a couple years later. I think the songwriting, once again, takes a major leap on here from the last couple records. I think White at this point is less interested in writing clear kind of blues rock pastiches and writing songs that feel, again, more fully formed, really like finding his voice as an intriguing and engaging songwriter. The opening track, Dead Leaves in the Dirty Ground, is spectacular, definitely a highlight on the record. Again, we talk about country influence continuously. I really like when White draws that in. Hotel Yorba, I think, is a good example of that. Fell in Love with the Girl is, the best known song on the record, one of the best known songs of their career. I love it. It's really cool to me when the Stripes kind of engage with that sort of punkier atmosphere of things. It happens, honestly, at point, I would honestly say it maybe doesn't happen enough for my liking, but when they really solidly engage with it, like on Fell in Love with a Girl, for instance, I think it works extremely well. Little Room is this just kind of delightfully demented little fragment on here. I think it's just so unnerving, and again, it keeps things. It's one of the moments on this record, one of several moments I think that again keep this from feeling like a very straightforward, clearly commercially accessible thing. This is still very zany and demented in kind of its own little category, in a way that I find really fascinating. So I like that. Offend in Every Way. It contains possibly my favorite guitar tone on this whole record. I think it sounds really great. I Can't Wait, Now Mary, I think are really strong. Just, again, really, really sharp stuff. One thing I haven't said about like these Stripes records as well is, talking about kind of the lengths of these songs and how for the most part they're pretty snappy and do not overstay their welcome in any particular way. So you have these records that are very accessible lengths, but are filled with 15, 16, 17, 18 songs. And, I love it. It keeps the momentum really strong. And I think that says a lot. I think that's really cool. I think, Jack White in general, I think you see this on many of these records. I think he knows how to pace a record really well. I think he understands album flow extremely well. And I don't think that's ever more apparent than on some of these classic Stripes records. So, in any case, White Blood Cells, really great album. Possibly controversial, a couple of the records that I have above it, but no doubt, I think, seminal release in the Stripes catalog and in Jack White's, and worth checking out if you haven't. White Blood Cells, my number 4. At number 3, I have the most recent Jack White project, 2024's No Name. I talked about this record in my 2024 top albums video. I can't really remember where I had it. I think it was top 15 somewhere. And all of my opinions from that video stay pretty much the same here. This is a stellar album. And while, again, I think Jack White's solo career for the most part is really strong, so I'm not going to paint this as a return from a stretch of disappointing records like some people might. There's still also no doubt to me this is his best solo project. This is his best thing that he's done outside of the White Stripes. And honestly, with time, who knows? This could very well be my favorite Jack White related project with time in general. Just when you think of all, the factors that went into, the environment that this record was in when it came out, right? This was a surprise release in an era where, Jack White was, I think, kind of seen as passé at this point. I think the 2022 Jack White records, I remember not hearing a whole ton about them when they came out. Just in the sense of, I think Boarding House Reach had polarized enough people to where I think White was becoming a little bit more of a secondary name, at least in mainstream music discussion circles. The idea that okay, his time has passed him by a little bit. And certainly I don't think people were expecting him to not only engage with blues rock again and garage rock and punkier influences as much as he does here, but I don't think people were expecting him to engage with them as well as he does here. The band on this record, I mentioned that, the band on the Raconteurs, Consolers of the Lonely is one of the best of his career. But the band on this record, the ensembles that he's playing with may very well be the best. I mean, it sounds unbelievable. The sheer energy. This is the most energetic record of Jack White's career. I will say that. And the fact that I'm saying that about a man who is, he's, 50 years old at this point, he'll be 50 this year, is pretty incredible. Old Scratch Blues starts the record off. And it starts it off in a way that is so promising. It works out so well. I love, there's a little kind of switch in feel midway through that I think is really, really great. And then it just keeps going and it doesn't let up. Bless Yourself. That's How I'm Feeling. It's Rough on Rats. I really like the track Underground on the second side. I think that's another one where you hear the Zeppelin influence come in a little bit more. This time thinking more kind of Physical Graffiti era Zeppelin, which is maybe my favorite era of the band. It's just, it's absolutely superb. And while it is back to basics in some ways, in a lot of ways, and I don't want to diminish that, you still, again, this is still very much vintage Jack White as far as like, these guitar tones are over the top. He's doing remarkable things with, just the technical playing and the sounds of the instruments and the songs themselves and how they sound still contain a vaguely psychedelic tinge. So this is still Jack White as eccentric and uncompromising as he's ever been. And it's a pretty insane return to form and a return to popular acclaim. And in that sense, yeah, it's hard for me to really evaluate this any lower. It's just a mind fuck of a record that goes start to finish, does not let up for its entire runtime. It knocks your socks off. It knocks my socks off every time I listen to it. And while it's not quite my number one, it's a record that absolutely could be in contention for that at some point. I do think it is that good. Stellar record, Jack White, No Name, my number 3. At number 2, I have the White Stripes again with 2005's Get Behind Me, Satan. I almost put this as my number 1. I almost did, and I'm another listen through to these albums, and I might get to that point. I do think it's that great. Certainly the most polarizing White Stripes record, for sure. A lot of people are not really into the experimental stuff that he's doing on here, which it's like, man, you think this shit is experimental? Like the stuff that he does 10, 15 years later is like, it's going to make this look like child's play. But again, I love it. As I will continue to say, as I will continue to bang the drum for, I like it when Jack White gets weird out here. So I'm all in. Let's do it. Really love I think Blue Orchid as the opener is really, really great. The Nurse, one of my favorite songs of theirs, just a completely beguiling and disturbing piece, but I think it's really, really great. You have really cool mandolin on tracks like Little Ghost. I really like that kind of folkier influence on here. The piano in the track White Moon, I think, works really well with White's vocal. Again, White and piano are not two things that feel like they pair together very often, although you do hear it on, some of these later Stripes records and on some of his solo stuff as well. But it works really well, I think, even with White's vocal tone not being one that would seem to mesh well with the elegance and the smoothness of a piano. And even the more kind of straightforward blues stuff, like Instinct Blues, for instance, still have this little... They seem a little bit more off kilter. They seem a little bit more like they're taken to an extreme. And, how much of that is a production thing? I think some of it certainly is a production. I think this record sounds great. And how much of it is just, them trying to stretch their playing in interesting ways? Hard to say, but I think even the more straightforward stuff on here, I think has a really interesting bend to it that I like quite a bit. And I think this record closes as well as any White Stripes record does, with Red Rain, which is absolutely stellar, and then I'm Lonely, But I Ain't That Lonely Yet, another piano-led track that closes it off really well. So, and that's the other thing, too, is, this is not just like a Boarding House Reach type of thing where it's more or less weird front to back, with a couple of, like, smoother moments scattered here and there. Like, Get Behind Me, Satan gets strange and, and uses a lot of different, like, eccentric instruments and things like that. But there's a beauty to this record, too. I think they use instruments like piano, instruments like the marimba and things like that in very... in elegant ways. And so I think it shows off a side of White as a songwriter and White as a producer that you don't get to hear very often. And because they're throwing so much of the kitchen sink into this thing, I think it feels like the White Stripes record that represents who Jack White is as a songwriter, as a musician, as an artistic figure, the best. Yes, I think people can argue that the records before it maybe are a bit tighter on the songwriting, and certainly I don't think you can argue that White Blood Cells and Elephant are more significant records from a popular acclaim, from a cultural acclaim standpoint. But I will absolutely advocate for Get Behind Me, Satan being like the most Jack White thing that the Stripes ever did. And in that sense, it's my number 2 now, but it could very well easily be my number 1 in the future. I love pretty much every second of it. I think it's stellar. And if you're not super into it, give it another chance. I think there's a lot to enjoy here. So yeah, check it out. But at number 1, we are going to go with the conventional pick for today, that being 2003's Elephant, also by the White Stripes. Of course, the record that is the most clearly associated with White and the Stripes in general, for good reason. Launching their careers into true national and international stardom off the backs of Seven Nation Army. And yeah, it's everything that you've heard about Seven Nation Army as a track is accurate. Is it a simplistic song? Perhaps, but there's no doubt that I think the track speaks to White as a guitarist and as a melodicist. Not really vocal melodies with this song, but really, again, just the kind of the melodic contour, the riff itself. And really, I think, accentuates the fact that White is actually quite good at writing hooks, or is becoming quite good at it at this point. And what makes Elephant work as a record, I think, is because this feels like, White Blood Cells was getting to this point as well, but it feels like White has really stepped into his own as a fully formed songwriter. Again, there's still a lot of energy in these tracks. There's still a lot of aggressiveness and moments where it feels like things are kind of going off the rails at points, but this feels like the moment where White is writing songs that are as good as pretty much any rock band was writing at that point. From a structural standpoint and from a melodic standpoint. Again, I was not really drawn into the lyrics at any point during this Jack White dive, in the sense that they were never they always felt secondary to me. They never felt like something that was of utmost importance. So in that sense, maybe the Stripes are not an essential rock band from the era from a lyrical standpoint, but yeah, I can't ignore the melodies, I can't ignore the instrumentation, and I can't ignore the power. The track There's No Home for You Here is another clear highlight to me. I think this is about as dynamic of a song as they do, just in general as a band, in the sense that you have the harder sections, but you also have some great harmonies and some great softer sections on that track. So again, I think you were seeing White as a band leader and as a musician really experiment with that type of idea more, which to me shows his maturation as a composer. Certainly great tracks scattered everywhere. Black Math is great. I just don't know what to do with myself. Ball and Biscuit is superb. Great extended track there. The Hardest Button to Button. Girl, You Have No Faith in Medicine. Really great stuff. Meg White also gets a vocal turn on here on the track In the Cold, Cold Night. And a lot of people are pretty negative on that one. But I could not disagree more. I think that is a stellar spotlight for her to be in the sense that, again, like, clearly not a trained singer, but the track itself gives her the best possible position to succeed. It's very sparse. It doesn't overwhelm her voice or put it in a very uncomplimentary place. It keeps things pretty stripped back, and it works. It works as a compliment or as a counterweight to everything else on the record really effectively, in my opinion. So yeah, I think Elephant is, like, when push comes to shove, I think Elephant has a lot of the same strengths as White Blood Cells that came before it, but I think it just feels like it's a little bit more mature. It's a little bit more finely realized. The songs feel a little bit more like they can stand on their own to muster. Like they can stand alone as individual listens and can be assessed as individual songs rather than as one of a collection of, again, like 18 songs or whatever that they're throwing onto a record. It's some of the best songwriting of Jack White's career. It's, I think, the best merging of, the White Stripes energy and execution with really sharp songwriting and the closest that they came to being, a true mainstream force to be reckoned with. So yeah, it's hard to know what else to say. Elephant, I think, is pretty much as good as advertised. It's not a runaway number one for me, as I've kind of hinted at. I think there's a couple of other records that are in pretty close contention and could get there one day. But no doubt, Elephant is a classic album for a reason, one of the best rock albums of the 2000s, and very worthy of being mine, and I'm sure many other people's number one pick. All right, and we have finished our Jack White White Stripes ranking. Potentially a little bit controversial at points, but you know what? That's the fun of it, right? It all comes down to how this stuff hits you, when it hits you, and that sort of thing. And as I said, I am really partial to Jack White as eccentric bluesman, not as much Jack White, just simple traditional bluesman. And that absolutely informs my evaluation here for sure. So let me know what your favorite Jack White, White Stripes, Raconteurs, Dead Weather, other assorted projects, what your favorites are. What are your favorite songs from these different projects? Where did you agree with me? Where did you disagree with me? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more videos like this, reviews, discography rankings, etc. are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Really helps to get the word out here. We are closing in on 1,000 subscribers, by the way. Really would love to get to that mark sooner rather than later. So tell a friend and maybe they will be number 1,000 and they can have bragging rights for the rest of their lives about that. Wouldn't that be nice? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.